Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome. It's great to see you. Welcome to Jacksonville University. Really pleased to have you here. My name is Rick Mullaney. I am the Robert T. Shercliffe, I'll give the full title, Executive Director in Public Policy here at Jacksonville University. I mention that name because most people here knew Mr. Shercliffe, who was really an institution here in Jacksonville, a great lover of Notre Dame and a great lover of this program. I know many of you, a lot of great friends here. In case you didn't know, the name Mullaney is Irish. I thought it'd be good for this group. And for this group in particular, I'll share with you something my father used to say, which is there are two types of people in the world, those who are Irish and those who wish they were. So I just thought I'd mention that to you. And I thought, I could say this to this club and it would be well received. Now, some of you are looking at me and you're going, Irish, but a lot of dark hair, a lot of dark eyes, what is all that? And the answer to that is I have a mother. And on my mother's side, they immigrated from Syria. So I'm half Irish and half Arabic. As my youngest brother likes to say, we're Arabic Monday to Fridays and we're Irish on the weekends. And so I just thought I'd share that all with you. I want to welcome all of you to the 9th annual Hesburgh Lecture, co-hosted by the Public Policy Institute and, of course, the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville. This has been an extraordinary series. And I do want to mention, too, it's truly phenomenal over the last decade. This is the 10-year anniversary of this partnership. It was 10 years ago in 2013. And he couldn't be here tonight, but I did want to mention Pat Kilbane. Some of you may know Pat is a little bit of a Notre Dame fan. For those of you who know Pat, of course he is. And he approached me back in 2013 and said, we should do this it'd be great for the community, great for Notre Dame, win-win-win all around. It certainly has been. It's been a terrific series over the last decade, but I want to put that decade in perspective if I can for a moment. This also happens to be, this fall, the 10-year anniversary of the Master in Public Policy program here at Jacksonville University. The reason I take a lot of reasons I take great pride in that, and we welcomed our first cohort in the fall of 2013, and this fall we welcomed our 11th cohort. This was the first MPP degree in the history of the state of Florida. And in 2015, we conferred the first MPP degrees in the history of Florida. We then, of course, added an executive MPP degree program, and we have 3 dual degree programs, MPP Marine Science, which, by the way, is the only MPP Marine Science dual degree program in the state of Florida. And Quint White is here, who is an icon. Where is Quint White? There is Quint, who's, of course, heading up the Marine Science program, who's done such an extraordinary job. The MPP MBA and MPP Juris Doctor. And I know Nick Allard was here earlier. If Nick is around, the Dean of the Law School was here visiting with us early. Over the past decade, we have really taken great pride in the MPP degree program. For the Institute, there's 3 parts to what we do. There's the academic program. We convene public policy events, which I'll talk about briefly, and community engagement and problem solving. But as I say often, the number one way we shape the future is through our graduates. And the MPP degree program, we think it's a high form of flattery when other universities start to copy you. So at the University of Central Florida a few years ago, they started an MPP degree program. The University of Miami, they started an MPP degree program. I got a call in the last 30 days from 2 other big public universities that want me to help them start MPP degree programs. That is a good thing for the sake of the future of our state and the country. By the way, we currently have about 70 students in the program. We're really pleased, and we try to adjust over time, but we really do believe that the MPP degree, that we are trying to educate, train, and prepare a new kind of leader in policy, politics, and in leadership. So also, another 10-year anniversary, if you can believe it. I mentioned that what we did at the Institute, our focus is on the academic program. But we found that we were uniquely positioned for events like this, really, and that is to be a convener for public policy education, a convener for public discussion, a convener for public policy events on campus. So in 2013, we hosted our first event on campus, our first public policy program on campus. Tonight is number 111 that we've hosted since 2013. Over 100 public policy programs on this campus. After tonight, 9 of them will be Hesburgh lectures. 14 of them have been televised debates. Actually 14 televised debates with Channel 4, 12 on campus, 2 were in studio for different reasons, pandemic and other reasons. But you may have seen some of them have gone statewide, such as the governor's race in 2018 with DeSantis and Putnam one night, Governor DeSantis, and the Democrats the next night. Also, we've been very pleased on campus to train elected officials. Nick Howland is here tonight, an elected official glad to have you here at the City Council. But back in 2019, we had all the City Council members after the election. And this year, in 2023, after the spring elections, we were very pleased to provide training for the City Council. And so since 2013 to now, we really do believe that this small liberal arts university in North Florida has become one of the leading venues in the state of Florida for public policy, education, discussion, and debate. One last 10-year anniversary I have to mention to you. You think it's hard to believe. 10 years Hesburgh lecture, 10 years MPP program, 10 years public policy program, but this isn't a coincidence. It's also the 10-year anniversary of President Kost's leadership at Jacksonville University. The reason I want to mention that to the people in this room is I know that there are a lot of deep roots in Jacksonville here in this room, and you've been to Jacksonville University, I think, before. Most of you are familiar with it. In April, we celebrate our 90th year, the anniversary of this university. There are over 60 colleges and universities in the state of Florida. And the next statement I'm going to make, I'm not making it lightly. Today, Jacksonville University is one of, if not the, most energetic, dynamic, and forward-looking universities in the state of Florida. That is the truth. And it really is because leadership matters. We studied in our MPP curriculum, leadership matters, even if it's unreasonable leadership. Leadership matters. It can transform the future, and that's what President Kost has done. If you know him, if you've seen the last decade, I could go on about what we've done on this campus, the partnerships we've had with Florida Blue, the starting of the law school, the first law school in 20 years, now in our second year of the law school here at Jacksonville University. We're the largest metropolitan area in the nation without a law school when that started. In 2 years, we'll break ground on a medical school, the first MPP degrees in the state of Florida, a doctorate, of course, in business, and a month ago, the accreditation of mechanical and civil engineering programs that didn't exist before. It has been extraordinary. The trajectory of this university has dramatically been changed by great leadership. So the past decade, I want to turn to the Notre Dame Club and say this. We sort of got started together. The Notre Dame Club was looking for a venue to grow this, to bring in significant faculty to Jacksonville, and we were in our infancy as an institute and as a program. And a decade later, thanks to the leadership of President Kost, you've seen Jacksonville University's trajectory change. You've seen the MPP program grow with our graduates and our students. You've seen the programs here on campus. But of course, you've seen this Hesburgh lecture with some really outstanding presentations over the last 10 years. And I'm looking forward to the next 10. So I do want to very briefly, I'm going to introduce Brian Corrigan in just a moment, but I do want to very briefly recognize a few people. He's going to be introduced in just a few moments, but of course, Dan Kelly. The law professor from Notre Dame. He'll be introduced more formally. He went to Harvard Law School. I've made it clear to Dan in our earlier conversations that this is a launching pad to the U.S. Supreme Court. and therefore, that was one of my pitches to get him to come here. And I'm going to introduce someone else, but I'm going to do it in a way that's not typical. Brian Corrigan's father is here. Typically, you don't introduce a federal judge that way, but we're very pleased to have Judge Corrigan here, who's a federal district court judge, of course. Elected officials, I mentioned Dick earlier. On our board, Gary Chartrand is here, and I want to mention a couple things about Gary. Gary is a founding board member. He'll have to rotate off the board this spring after 12 years. I've teased Gary that he is the heir apparent to Bob Sherman. That community steward who cares about doing great things for the community, does it with vision and generosity, and we're so pleased to have Gary here tonight, too. We have a number of leadership from Jacksonville University. I won't mention all of them, but the Dean of Arts and Sciences with Chris Corbo, the Dean of the Law School, of course, with Nick Allard, Quint White with the Marine Science. Really pleased to have all of you here. Now, of course, I did want to mention, I know that there are a few people here who graduated from Notre Dame. So if you did, would you please stand up if you graduated from Notre Dame? And a hand for our Notre Dame graduates. And you're about to get outnumbered by another group, which is if you're a graduate student in public policy, or an alum. Would you please stand up? And of course, I want to thank a number of our faculty members that are here tonight too. So very briefly on this lecture series. Father Hesburgh, of course, was not only an icon at Notre Dame, he was an icon nationally, serving, of course, as president of Notre Dame from 1952 to 1987. Talk about public policy and shaping public policy. I mean, he's an icon for all of us. And of course, this was a natural collaboration and partnership because the values of this institute were not Republican or Democrat, red jersey or blue. We have our core values that we embrace fully include integrity, civility, accountability, courage, and stewardship. It's been a wonderful partnership. And over the last decade, I want you to think about the topics we've talked about. The very first one was on the debt crisis, which, by the way, you may have noticed hasn't gone away. Energy prices, China, climate change, the Supreme Court, Iran and North Korea, last year, of course, with Islam. And tonight, we're going to talk about the biggest asset class in the world, which is real estate. So we look forward to hearing from Professor Kelly. And with that, I want to introduce to you the president of the Notre Dame Club, Brian Corrigan. Brian himself, wait a second, Brian, he went to Notre Dame, graduated in 2009. He's been president of the club since 2020. He has a master's degree in public administration. His father, of course, a federal judge, his uncle, a professor here. The Corrigan family is truly an extraordinary family here in Jacksonville. And it is a pleasure working with Brian, the president of the Notre Dame Club, Brian Corrigan.
Well, I'm pretty sure after that I'm going to take Rick as my hype man wherever I go. So thank you for Rick. On behalf of the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, I'd like to welcome you to the Hesburgh Lecture. As Rick mentioned, the Hesburgh Lecture is named after longtime Notre Dame president, Father Ted Hesburgh, who was a champion of lifelong learning. And in that spirit, this program was inaugurated in 1986 to take Notre Dame professors out into the communities around the country in lectures that are always free and open to the public to share that love of learning with both the Notre Dame community and the communities we all call home. Father Ted, as Rick mentioned, not only took a small regional Midwest Catholic school that was known for its football program and turned it into a preeminent research university known around the globe, but also played an important role in public policy issues in a wide variety of avenues. He served as the chairman of the Civil Rights Commission. He was the Vatican's appointee to the Atomic Energy Commission, among many, many other ventures. He also is the recipient of both the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal, and holds 150 honorary degrees, which for a while was the most in history, although it has been surpassed, which I'm sure he's pretty annoyed about. As Rick mentioned, this is our 9th time co-hosting with JU and the Public Policy Institute, and we could not be more grateful for Rick, Catherine, and the entire public policy team's support of this program. It has only been enhanced through this collaboration, and again, we look forward to years to come with JU, so we thank you for that. With that, I'll ask Dr. Peter Fitzpatrick from our club to come up and introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good. It was my pleasure to introduce tonight's Hesburgh speaker. Daniel Kelly is a professor of law at Notre Dame Law School and the director of the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. He earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Notre Dame and law degree from Harvard Law School. He began his legal career clerking on the U.S. Court of Appeals, Second Circuit in New York, and working as a litigation associate at Kravitz, Swaine & Moore. He also served as a research fellow at Yale and Harvard Law Schools. Professor Kelly's research focuses on the economic analysis of property rights, including the acquisition and assembly of land for development, the division and use of property through contracts, leases, and trusts, and the transfer of property at death. He has published extensively in such journals as Cornell Law Review, Columbia Law Review, Emory Law Journal, Supreme Court Economic Review, Florida Law Forum, and many others. In addition to teaching at Notre Dame Law School, Professor Kelly is a frequent lecturer on property law at Sponsors for Educational Opportunity Law Institute. Also, he serves as a faculty advisor for the program of study in real estate law and the Real Estate Law Society. Tonight, Professor Kelly will present The Promises and Perils of Housing, the Kelo case, and the world's largest asset class. And I will add one more thing. He tells me he is not related to Brian Kelly, okay? In case you were wondering. Okay. So please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Kelly.
So thank you, Peter. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Rick. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I know everyone is busy with work and family and friends. So this is truly an honor to be here in Jacksonville talking with you tonight. I'm hoping that it'll be interactive. So feel free to jump in with questions, comments. There'll be a Q&A at the end, and Rick and I are going to do a little back and forth, but I really want to engage your ideas, your thoughts about this important topic. So just a brief background, and then I'll dive into the substance, which is real estate, the world's largest asset class. Talk a little bit about how I initially got interested in it, both as a student, I know there are a lot of students here, and as a scholar and faculty member, and then maybe highlight a few of the instances over the last decade or so, including the great financial crisis, including COVID, and including some of the issues that might be coming on the horizon, both nationally and in Florida, where I think real estate could be very, very significant. And that's both commercial real estate, which includes all the office buildings in Jacksonville and throughout the country, industrial buildings, retail, mixed use, multifamily and apartments. It also includes the important issue of housing. And I think both the country and the state, and I'm sure in the communities here, housing is an increasingly significant issue, especially housing affordability. So Rick stole a little bit of my thunder, because as a professor, I was going to ask a few easy questions at the beginning, like, who here is a Notre Dame alum? Who's here part of the Jacksonville Public Policy Institute? And you kind of took my questions there, Rick. So now I'll have to ask the harder questions, all right? But I won't put anybody on the spot. But just want to get a little sense of the room, and then I might ask a few kind of statistics questions, but there's not really a right or wrong answer. It's just having you guess and engage a little bit. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I have a background both on the law side and on the real estate side. But I have a firm interest ever since I was a student in public policy. So at Notre Dame, I was both an econ major and a history major, and I did a concentration in philosophy, politics, and economics, and public policy, which is why I think Rick and the Public Policy Institute here is so vital to some of the key issues of the day. These public policy issues are so important for any time and any generation. And I think it's important when you're thinking about these issues, and I've tried to do this both as a student, but now as a professor, hopefully trying to teach students and form them and educate them at the University of Notre Dame, to think about the public policy issues, both informed by some of the great thinkers across decades, indeed centuries. So that's why I think it's important, because every generation confronts issues and crises, both nationally and globally, and right now in the Middle East is just the latest example. It's important, and educational institutions like the University of Notre Dame and Jacksonville University, what we're trying to do is form the next generation of leaders who can confront issues we may not even know about. So I think public policy is key, and you kind of have to have the long perspective on policy issues. At the same time, we all come to these issues with predispositions, thoughts based on, what our teachers have told us, what our parents have told us, and all that's to the good. And at the same time, when we look to legislative enactments, when we look to what regulators are doing, when we look to what the courts are doing, it's important to keep in mind two things. One is institutional roles. What is my role as a legislature or as a judge, right? Not everyone is sort of the despot, the king who can just decide. So we have to know our roles. But secondly, we have to think about the effects of public policy, whether it's real estate or any public policy, healthcare. And too often, I think people ignore the consequences or effects. So part of my background in economic analysis of property law and law more generally is thinking about, okay, if we enact policy A, what would be the effects? What are the incentives for everyone who might be playing in that world? Versus if we enact policy B, what are the effects, right? And intentions are important, but as we all know, sometimes the most well-intentioned policies can have very bad unintended consequences. So that's a theme that's true in real estate or housing or pick your area. Okay, so let's dive into real estate and housing. So real estate, and this is kind of my pitch for why people should be interested in real estate. Real estate is the world's largest asset class. What do I mean by that? So world's largest asset class. If you add up the total value of real estate, all of the commercial real estate, all of the single family homes and apartments, the total value of real estate is by most estimates about 50% of the world's asset values. So that's everything. It equals or exceeds everything else combined. So you take all the Googles and the Apples, all the publicly traded companies, all of that value, which is a lot, doesn't even combine throughout all industries, is a little bit less than the total asset value of real estate. So what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is there's huge financial, economic value in real estate. And we kind of saw that in 2007, 2008 with the great financial crisis, that when things and public policies are designed poorly, both for individuals, communities, and the global economy, can really take a hit. And there the story was mostly about residential, homes, residential mortgage-backed securities, and sort of when the bubble burst in the housing market, there were a lot of very bad effects that lasted for years. But if real estate's the world's largest asset class, it's not only a financial issue, and this is one of the things that we really try to emphasize to our students at Notre Dame in the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate, or FIRE for short. So if you hear me talk about FIRE, there's not a fire in the building. I'm talking about our institute at Notre Dame that focuses on real estate. And actually there's a nice connection with Father Hesburgh too, because Father Hesburgh's favorite prayer was "Come Holy Spirit," right? Come Holy Spirit. And so as FIRE, and our founding benefactor says, that should be our prayer, because what we're trying to do is not only about financial value, it's about how real estate affects individuals. And if we think about our own lives, whether it's, where we start each day in our homes and apartments, if it's where we go to work in the office, if it's where we go to play or pray, real estate is everywhere. It affects, so in addition to that financial value, if you think about the human value, the social value of real estate, we need to be very cognizant of how we design real estate, whether you're talking about real estate developers, real estate investment, whether it's real estate private equity or publicly traded real estate investments, and the public policies that affect real estate. And I think housing is example number one there. Okay. So, and I think the thing that sort of highlighted, I think, for many people, the importance of real estate is COVID, right? Some of the things that we all took for granted about where we were living or working or playing or praying, COVID at least for a brief period, upended all of those. It kind of reminded us that, wow, some of these things we take for granted, now they're not open, or we have to switch, or there's tremendous mobility movements in terms of people we're living. Florida was probably a beneficiary of that, although people, I think, were flocking to Florida even pre-COVID. But I know in South Bend, the day that the schools closed in March of 2020, my wife and I looked at each other, and we have 5 children who now range in age from a junior in high school to a kindergartner. We don't always make the fastest decisions when it comes to kind of big decisions. But when hell broke loose and the schools closed and her parents are down in Florida, we jumped in the car and we said, we're going to drive straight down to Florida as fast as possible. So the first few months, we rented a place in Florida. We love Florida. We come here as often as we can, especially when in South Bend, the snow starts about November 15th and lasts through May 1st. You think I'm joking, but no, it's 50-50 whether it snows on Halloween. So Florida has a lot going for it. And we decided, okay, we want to come down to Florida as soon as possible. We weren't the only ones, right? It's not like we had some magical thinking. Lots of people said, Florida, things are going well. From a weather standpoint, from a policy standpoint, in many communities, from an affordability standpoint, although now with everybody coming down, there's some areas of Florida that have gotten pretty expensive, and we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. So let me pause there because earlier this year, we did an event, the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate Fire did an event in Southeast Florida. And we brought together a number of alumni, parents and friends in the Notre Dame community for this event. But in addition to the cocktails and the dinner, we had a conference with a number of great speakers, including a gentleman who works in the state of Florida in kind of the research arm of the Chamber of Commerce. And I brought a few of the statistics that he shared. I'm just going to pull them up here. So this is the first interactive portion of the presentation. So let me have a guess from the audience. So he presented some stats, both about where Florida is now, but also where Florida might be in 2030. It's sort of the Florida 2030 blueprint. And a lot of these stats and figures I think are important because they will affect what Florida should be thinking about in terms of real estate and housing. So let's have a few audience guesses. If Florida was its own country, how big in terms of ranking all of the countries right now, and I think he also included like if California was its own country, et cetera, how big would Florida be overall as an economy? Any guesses? Like let's say 60 is one guess. Oh, 16. Third. 10. 5th. 25th. I feel like we're in an auction here. The first guess was exactly right. 16th. 16th. I don't know if it was a guess or you've heard that before. Or you might be. That was pretty good. There you go. And then the second thing he said was by 2030, if Florida continues on its current trajectory, and obviously it's a matter of public policies and continuing to attract people to Florida, attract employers, attract residents, attract capital. But sort of their goal by 2030, any guesses there? Moving up, they want to move up, not down. From 16, 8's close. 6th. He has number 10, right? And so that would include potentially a net of 2.8 million new residents, according to what the statistics he was citing, close to 1.5 million new jobs, a lot more visitors to Florida. He threw out the figure of 50 million visitors. Couple other statistics. And these are areas where Florida is doing very well, right? And I think will have implications for the real estate markets locally and statewide. Florida household formation outpaces the nation. So between 2010 and 2021, the statistic nationally, household formation 11.3%, Florida 21.8%. Another statistic, I'll give you another chance to guess if you want to guess. Florida's employment continues to rise. In fact, you've passed New York for number 3 in the nation in terms of total jobs, so congratulations on that. Anybody have a guess as of December of 22, how many people employed in the state of Florida? I'll give you a hint. It's 7 figures, but high 7 figures. Oh. Yeah, so just over 9 million. So 9.57 million jobs. Florida also leads the nation, and this is getting back to this kind of pre-COVID and COVID trends, leads the nation. So this is number 1. At Notre Dame, we always love to be number 1 in football. We don't always quite get there, at least since 1988. But it's always about being number 1 at the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. We want to be the number 1 real estate institute. I know Rick wants to be the number 1 public policy institute. Florida leads the nation in income migration. And these figures are kind of amazing. So per hour, Florida was bringing in, this is income migration net. For a while, it was $2 million net of people moving in and their total wealth. And then it went up to $2.7 million early in 2023. And if you think of other states that seem to be the hot states like Texas, Texas was positive net income migration, but way below Florida. So $730,000 per hour. So there's a lot of people moving around. There's also a lot of wealth moving around. And this creates opportunities. It also creates potential challenges, right? And that's the promises and perils. There's lots of promise. But with that, even things like real estate prices and housing prices might be going up. They're going up because of inflation, and inflation is a significant issue. But in Florida, they're going up not only because of inflation, but they're going up because of increased demand and people flocking to Florida, which is a good thing. It presents opportunities, but it also presents challenges. By contrast, states like Illinois, which is where I was born and raised, just outside of Chicago, they were losing Illinois was 964,000 in the negative per hour. New York and California, more than $2 million negative per hour. So there's some startling trends that I think will be important both for folks in the real estate investment and development world, but also for all of us. All right, final statistic, on Florida. In terms of the top larger states, so we're thinking here Florida, California, Texas, New York, Illinois. In terms of their growth of GDP, gross domestic product, Florida was the top of the larger states. So number 4 overall, but easily beating California, Texas, New York, Illinois between quarter 4 of 2018 and quarter 3 of 2022. Florida increased by 13.4%, blew all the other larger states away. So public policy-wise, you must be doing something right in Florida for some of these statistics. Okay, so back to real estate. What are all these implications of all what's going on for real estate? And I want to hit on 3 topics before we do our fireside chat and Q&A. So the 3 topics would be, how did I initially get interested in real estate? And there's a lot of public policy stories there. And then, what's been going on since then? What are the major challenges with real estate? Concluding with the 3rd and final piece, which are housing and the opportunities and challenges in housing. Okay, so let's spend a couple minutes on each of these. When I was an undergrad at Notre Dame and then moving into law school, one of the hot topics was, when can the government through its use of the eminent domain power. So the government has this power called eminent domain, where by force it can take somebody's property if it's for public use and if it gives just compensation. And the Fifth Amendment of the US Constitution says, quote, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So the Supreme Court of the United States, in a couple of earlier cases, there's a case in 1954 based in Washington, D.C., the Berman case, and there's a case in 1984, Midkiff out of Hawaii. The Supreme Court had kind of confronted this issue of what is a public use. Both times the court unanimously adopted a very broad definition of public use that basically said public use is any public benefit. Unanimously. Both those cases were unanimous. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there began to be some additional litigation on this issue for a couple of reasons. One, cities and towns were looking to do economic revitalization, urban development, and oftentimes cities, along with private developers or private entities or corporations, might say, well, we need to use eminent domain to assemble several fragmented parcels into one new parcel that a developer might find more attractive. You also started to see more litigation because eminent domain had been used, and here's both where history and public policy kind of meet. In the 1950s and 1960s, eminent domain had been used to try to jumpstart urban renewal, but with very bad consequences. So government officials thought that urban renewal and eminent domain could solve what at the time was called, quote unquote, urban blight. But the consequences of many of those issues where they literally cleared blocks at a time, decades later, was not good, right? Secondly, the consequences were not spread equally. Oftentimes in the 50s and 60s, the use of eminent domain targeted communities with ethnic minorities, right? The politically disfavored. It was kind of a tool that was used that both had bad consequences and ones that were discriminatory. So these cases started bubbling up later in the 90s and 2000s. And so this began to be a litigated issue. And as a student sitting there, I was like, wow, this is really interesting stuff. Because on the one hand, the United States has a long tradition of valuing private property rights, right? Private property is sacrosanct in the United States. And so there's this kind of individual rights, libertarian view of, hey, you can't take my property, right? Especially if you're trying to give it to some other private individual. And then there were people also arguing, though, that, hey, we need these projects for the common good, for the public interest. And so this was very on the ground in terms of these issues, but it was also kind of high-level philosophy of, do we respect individual private property rights? Do we do something that arguably is for the public interest, even though sometimes it doesn't work out for the public interest? And so I was fascinated by this issue. And what I did early in my research was to suggest, hey, maybe we can have our cake and eat it too, because what I said or what I did was I drew a distinction. When the government used eminent domain for a traditional public use, like a road, like a courthouse, like any kind of government facility, then maybe the government should have that power. But if the government is using eminent domain to take from one private individual and transfer it to another private individual for the purpose of quote unquote economic development, then maybe the Constitution should have something to say about that. And even if at the time the US Constitution wasn't interpreted as prohibiting that, and it's still not, states sometimes do, or legislatures thinking about what's a wise public policy decision sometimes do. So I wrote about that, and as I was writing about that, the Supreme Court actually took a new case called Kelo versus City of New London, which squarely addressed that issue. And I won't bore you with all the gory legal details. Suffice it to say, it was a very closely contested decision. People thought it might be 9-0 again, or 7-2. It turned out to be one of these 5-4 decisions. The court actually upheld the use of eminent domain to take Suzette Kelo's property in New London, Connecticut, and the court continue to kind of define public use broadly and defer to legislatures to decide the public use. Obviously, the individual property owners in the case were not happy about that, but one of the things that the case did do was spur a massive backlash throughout the United States. So as all of you know, Americans are often divided on issues. We can't agree, what color the sky is. On this issue, surveys after the case showed widespread agreement, or I guess disagreement, with the court's decision, right? Across political lines, ideological lines, racial lines, you name it, Americans were like skeptical of this decision, okay? So what happened then was, within the 5 years after Kelo, 45 of the 50 states passed either a legislation or a constitutional amendment tightening the use or prohibiting it altogether, the use of eminent domain for these private economic development takings. And actually Florida, which before Kelo, some public interest law firms, including the Institute for Justice, tracked how many instances of eminent domain use or abuse there were. On their list, at least, Florida was kind of the worst offenders pre-Kelo, right? People using eminent domain all over the place. And sometimes it's not the use, it's the threatening of it to say, hey, we're going to take your land unless you sell it to us voluntarily. Florida had been one of the major users of eminent domain, but then post-Kelo, Florida, first through the legislature and then by constitutional amendment, actually ended up having one of the most robust protections of private property. They said you can't use eminent domain if it's for an economic development taking, and they even said if it is a matter of blighted property, also that's off limits. Okay, so that's how initially I got interested in real estate and property. Obviously, there's things happened since the early 2000s. So we mentioned the great financial crisis. That kind of woke people up again. Hey, these things called mortgages, they're important, right? Hey, the public policy that relates to real estate and the financial sector and mortgage-backed securities, that's important. Hey, these rating agencies that are rating the properties, that's important. That mostly happened on the residential side, right? That had fallout, right, in terms of foreclosures, in terms of the negative spillovers. And Florida kind of bore the brunt of this at the time. It was one of those states that got hit pretty hard when the bubble burst. So the fallouts, there were a lot of effects of that. Then fast forward another 5 years, or 5 or 10 years, and COVID hits. And all of a sudden, COVID creates massive disruption in the real estate industry. So we can talk about this more during Q&A. But if you think about all the sectors, so the office sector, right? Now people aren't going into downtown areas and offices in many cities, right? Especially New York, Chicago. What does that change, right? What are we going to do with all the, I heard on CNBC today that basically the office sector is $2 trillion, right? Increasing vacancies. What does that mean? Are these going to be repurposed for housing? Sometimes that's very difficult and costly. What are we going to do office sector? Retail, right? How we buy things in stores has changed dramatically. Now it's very easy to jump on Amazon.com and order something. So our retail stores, regional shopping malls, very hard hit both before COVID and during COVID. If you think about industrial, that was something that 20 years ago in the United States you might have thought, hey, our manufacturing has been offshored, what's the future here? Well, a lot of smart real estate entrepreneurs and investors said, we might buy up some of these industrial parcels. And now because of the need for logistics and warehouses, Amazon needs places, warehouses, other folks do as well. Industrial has exploded and continues to do well. And then last but not least, coming to multifamily and the housing sector. So multifamily refers to apartments, usually 30 or more. And so it's a very important sector for housing. And obviously single family homes as well play into housing. But I want to end with housing because I think it's such an important issue both for the nation and for Florida, and it's something at the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate Fire that we're really focused on. So right now, there are at least, depends who you ask, but there are at least a shortage of 5 to 7 million housing units in the United States. And the housing affordability crisis affects several socioeconomic levels, right? So clearly homelessness is a perennial issue in the United States. And then when we look globally, the homelessness statistics are startling. But so homelessness is part of it, but also affordable housing, including government subsidized housing, workforce housing, so this would be market rate housing. There is a shortage of units, right, across the board. And so workforce housing would include things like, everybody who during COVID saved us, the first responders, the nurses, the teachers who came in, right? Workforce housing, there is a massive shortage. And I want to pose the question, why, and this is something we're investigating through research and through involvement of alumni, parents, friends, our real estate network, why is there this shortage of housing? It's not the absence of wealth, right? The housing crisis is probably worst in California. And California, there's a lot of affluence and money, right? I would pose that one of the problems is public policy and the policy we have toward housing. So there's several things, obviously the supply and demand of housing that go into it. But one of the things that we've encountered, both in talking to industry folks and in talking to folks on the academic scholarly side, is that often housing policy is mixed up or backwards. It's been an issue for 50, 60 years. Some of the major cities that want more housing often say we need more affordable housing, but sometimes the policies they have focused on housing are exactly the opposite or have at least unintended consequences. So one thing that I think we really need to look at, and what I'm thinking about here is actually, I'm blaming my own profession, the kind of legal regulatory side, right? Our zoning policies need reform. Our land use policies and land use regulations need reform, right? We need to somehow figure out an issue to this whole not in my backyard problem, which is, oh yeah, we support more housing, but we don't want it in my backyard, right? Because it may depreciate my asset values, right? If I own an expensive unit or an expensive piece of property, you increase more supply, my private investment goes down, right? Even simple things like having cities be more flexible in issuing building permits, right? Real estate developers, the home building industry, they're ready. The private sector can be activated, right? We need to make sure that we have the right public policies in place to make that happen. So look forward to chatting. I know Rick and I are going to go back and forth a little bit and look forward to the Q&A. So thanks very much for your attention.
Dan, thank you very much. I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to those of you from the audience if you may have a few questions. But I think it's fair to say, and my first question is going to talk about housing. And I think what people in the room are experiencing, which is a little bit of sticker shock for a lot of people in the room, the rise of prices in housing in Florida and around the country, interest rates, and that crisis has hit a lot of people. Many of us in this room, or some of us in this room, may remember coming out of 1980 with double-digit interest rates, double-digit unemployment, and double-digit unemployment. And housing prices, but for more than 20 years, there was this somewhat stability, low interest rates, artificially low interest rates. But housing has turned into a crisis. And the real question I want to ask is there any relief in sight for everybody? But before asking that question, I'd like you to talk a little bit deeper about the cause of this housing crisis, and in particular, I'm talking about residential housing. One last anecdote. In my house, to give you an example, I have one child who lives in Chicago. They're all grown. One child lives in Chicago, one lives in Virginia, and one lives down the hall on the left. And I don't think I'm alone in that. It's because of the housing affordability crisis. So can you give us some insight into that?
It's a great question. It's a big question. So it's a multifaceted issue, and as real estate people know, it's all geographic region specific, so it's hard to make kind of sweeping statements either about the United States or about Florida. But in general, I think in terms of causes, I think there's two main things, at least two main things in Florida. So one we're definitely living in an inflationary environment where prices across the board are going up. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Fed has raised interest rates, because they were trying to get ahead of inflation. The inflation was sort of, not temporary, it was more sustained. And so they very quickly ratcheted up interest rates, which affects both the residential real estate market and the commercial real estate market. And there's some concern that commercial real estate could have some, I'm not predicting another great financial crisis based on commercial, but there's going to be a lot of pain and a lot of distress in it. But on residential, I think it's made it difficult for homeowners or people who are looking to switch homes or first-time home buyers, because they were expecting a certain rate, or maybe right now they're locked into a rate where they're paying, 3.5%, 4.5% interest on their mortgage. And the idea of moving, so sort of economists would want mobility, or that at least they would not want frictions preventing people. If you have a new job or you need to move to a new city, or within the same city you want to change, you don't want unnecessary barriers to doing that, right? Because that's kind of an economic loss. So when you have higher interest rates, people may be less inclined to sell their existing properties. I do think in Florida that part of the huge increase in prices is, in addition to the kind of inflationary environment, just the demand, right? Florida, all those statistics I gave in terms of the migration, the new number of residents, that if you have, I know people are building houses still in Florida, but you have a housing stock and then you add, millions of new folks flooding the zone, many of whom have a lot of money, it's going to increase prices. So I think a couple of the interesting effects to get your, is there any relief in sight? In some places, especially I think in Southeast Florida, Miami, West Palm Beach, I'm not sure there's any relief in sight, right? They probably have the biggest housing issue, right? Plus you add on things like, okay, what are, hurricane insurance and insurance rates? And I know that's been a real issue here in Florida. So it's not just the cost of the land and then the cost of building it, but then when you're insuring the building on top of it, and it's difficult to insure, or people are starting to self-insure. I feel like historically Jacksonville has actually been an area that has provided kind of a broad range of kind of affordability in housing, right? It's kind of been very good in that. So I think the issue for here, and is there relief in sight, is to what extent people, even within Florida, are moving from these sort of super expensive areas up to Jacksonville or across to Jacksonville, and whether that also, not only the in-migration from other states, but within Florida, the migration that's moving. So I'm not sure there's any relief in sight. Like my, I think, goal from a public policy standpoint would be, okay, how do you channel the influx of people into opportunities? And I think that's where public policy comes in. You have to have the right, because the world is dynamic, right? So kind of looking backwards isn't going to work. Now, how can Florida leverage those opportunities? New people, new wealth, new businesses, and with the right policies in place, yeah, then you can generate more housing that should at least stabilize house prices to a certain extent.
That leads very naturally to the question, talking about public policy. You mentioned earlier that legal issues and public policy have affected supply, and certainly this, what you just described is a supply and demand problem, right? We've got huge demand, we've got a small supply, prices going up. You mentioned zoning and reforming zoning. You mentioned land use and reforming land use. What specifically, or what might you do in the zoning area in ways of reform that might help? And what might you do in land use in terms of reform?
Yeah, so I think for many areas it's more flexibility in the zoning. So zoning has a kind of a long and checkered history. But one of the main things that sort of the zoning model created was, let's separate all the land uses. Let's have residential in this area. Let's have commercial industrial in this area, right? So you have these separate land uses. And there were some, rationale or justification for that, especially coming off the Industrial Revolution of not having spillover effects. But in some ways, it kind of went too far. And so the ability, I mean, if you look at kind of the hot neighborhoods today or the places where people want to be, they're often mixed uses, right? Where you have residential and retail and commercial all mixed together. So some of that has started to pop online through things called planned unit developments, where you kind of developers negotiate with city officials to kind of say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. But I think more flexibility, not just with planned unit developments, but more flexibility to create multifamily or duplexes. And so, and not to denigrate single family homes at all. I'm a big fan. I think there's a lot of advantages to that. But having a mix of types of housing, that it's not so restricted. And again, it varies by state and locality, right? Some cities and states just have crazy rules, whether it's about parking or about other things that prevent, natural or accessory dwelling units, where people might build another place of habitation on their property. Kind of creating more opportunities for more innovative types of housing, I think can only help. In Florida, I know one of the issues is obviously there's a heavy public policy emphasis on preservation and ecology, right? So Florida has a lot of land, outside the coast that's not really developed. So I think, and I don't have the answer there in terms of the right balance between, the ecological benefits and development, but I think that is a huge issue. And I think there's some examples where you can kind of have a both and, like sometimes there's this view that, well, the environmentalists, they're anti-development. And the real estate guys, they just want to, develop the heck out of everything, and they don't care about nature and the environment. But I've seen successful examples, even in Florida, and some members of our advisory board are involved in some of these deals, where you can actually achieve both sustainability, but you can also create new opportunities in housing.
It's interesting you mentioned that because here in Jacksonville, we actually had the largest local government land acquisition program in the country a few years back and took about 80 square miles out of development for recreational purposes. But I think there's some big public policy issues there. And your public policy discussion on zoning and land use, naturally, and you kind of addressed this in part, but, and it's maybe opposites, very related, this affordable housing issue, but affordable housing in general. And when you and I were talking yesterday briefly, we talked about, for example, for teachers, for police officers, for nurses. What do you do? Because this environment is so challenging.
Yeah, I think there has to be, you need to, if you get the public policy right, and this is maybe idealistic, but I kind of hope that universities and institutes can help to think through what are the best ideas, right, and train the next generation. So in my view, universities, including institutes, are kind of thinking about the ideas because they're not subject necessarily to political pressure, right? They have the opportunity to talk to people in industry, to look at the academic research. So there should be ideas emanating from public policy institutes, real estate institutes, et cetera. That needs to inform public policies, right? There has to be a channel there. If you can have all the great ivory tower thinking in the world, if it doesn't translate into what local officials and legislatures actually do or don't do, it's kind of for naught. So there has to be ideas informing public policy, because I do think if you get the public policy right, there are people in the private sector, real estate developers, real estate, I was kind of doing my own thing at Notre Dame as an academic, kind of thinking about, the big thoughts. The people I've met over the last 5 years in the industry, one, just incredible in terms of what they can do when they see a project like this shortage of housing that could be addressed. And two, despite their reputation as sort of the evil real estate developers, most of them, at least most of them in the Notre Dame network, are actually out for good. They want to create places of lasting value. They want to advance the common good. Yes, investment return is important because otherwise money is going to flow to other things. But they actually have, whether it's people in our network working on housing or helping the Catholic Church and other nonprofits, they actually want to do things that are for good. So if we get the right ideas, translate that into policy, the private sector actually can do a lot of good, and they have sort of the resources and they can scale. This housing issue, you have to do it at scale. It's not going to be solved overnight. So if we do that, and oftentimes, obviously, it's still working with government, whether it's public-private partnerships, I know that's a common vehicle, or just working with officials to get the land use approval. One of my professors said one time when he was teaching land use law, This class really isn't about the law because land use planning is 95% politics. Well, if that's the case, we need people who are on the same page, both with ideas and translating that into action.
Well, I have a couple more questions, and then if any of you have any questions, please keep in mind we'll take a few questions from the audience. I did want to shift a little bit to commercial real estate. I certainly don't think Jacksonville is unique when I say this. When you think of commercial real estate in downtown, we have a lot of empty office buildings. The pandemic has hit us hard, and it's hit the whole country hard, and there's unforeseen consequences for many from enjoying working from home, but one of the consequences is some empty office space. And of course, that some of those mortgages are 3, 5, 7 years out. And my question is there a bit of a ticking time bomb in this country when it comes to commercial real estate?
I don't have a crystal ball. And if I knew that answer, I probably wouldn't be teaching at Notre Dame. I would be playing the stock market or, shorting something like people should have been doing before 2007, 2008, before the bubble burst. And this is mostly anecdotal based on people who I have great people in the real estate industry who I get to kind of run into and interact with at Notre Dame. But I do have some concerns because like you said, unlike, residential mortgages, which are either, 30-year fixed or 15-year fixed, or sometimes they're variable for shorter periods, commercial real estate loans are typically on those shorter time periods. And so when we've seen this massive, or not massive, because I know interest rates have been higher, but significant increase in interest rates, right, from how people were doing the financing just 3 or 4 years ago. So it doesn't hit exactly when the interest rate goes up because you might still have a mortgage going for a couple of years. But when that mortgage comes due and they're going to go to a bank or some other financing mechanism to get it done, and they had penciled out the deal at a certain interest rate, and now the interest rate they're getting is much higher, what do? Do they walk away and all of a sudden the banks don't want, just like in the housing crisis, right? The banks don't want to be property owners, but that is the collateral on some of these deals. And so, especially office makes me nervous. I've been told that it's very site specific, right? So there's some places where it's Class A office and it's a very good location that they could be fine. But then a few blocks away, where you have this older office building that nobody wants to be in, right? Especially with work from home. That's kind of the big trend that everybody's discussing now. Work from home during COVID, and to what extent that's going to be a permanent trend, to what extent people will work from home or work across the country. And I'm kind of a big believer in you need to come together. I mean, that's what cities are for, right? Is people exchanging ideas, people being in close proximity. And so you have those there's also nice amenities sometimes because you can build things at scale. But cities, we're all social, as Aristotle says, we're social beings, right? And that goes for sort of, we want to hang out and have receptions together, but we also want to work together, right? And if you're a student going to the workforce right now, getting mentorship in a work from home model, not really going to work, right? You want to be there with a partner or the leader of the firm that's going to teach you. So I think in many industries, you'll still need office, but where those offices are and what the vacancy rate is and whether rents go down, I do think we might be in for some pain. I just hope it doesn't have the ripple effects across the U.S. economy or the global economy like the financial crisis did in 07-08.
Yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to get in line. We have one last question here, and I will call on you. We have a microphone set up. A local issue,
Yeah.
and maybe you can talk about it in general terms, is we have a proposal from the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's about a $2 billion deal and kind of a real estate deal in many ways. $1.4 billion of it is for a stadium renovation, really a new stadium. Another $600 million for sort of the mixed-use development, but also a sports complex entertainment district. And my question is, in looking around the country, can the new stadium or the renovated stadium, can this provide sort of a catalyst for these kinds of residential, retail, entertainment types of developments? Because it certainly is a big issue here locally.
Absolutely. I've been talking to people the last couple of days about this issue. So a couple of thoughts. So without weighing on the details of the proposal, I don't want to be quoting the papers or something, is weighing in on whether you should do it or not. So Jacksonville is not alone in this. There are other communities, and obviously, you're kind of looking at similar in terms of size, et cetera. And Minneapolis has actually embarked on a successful project with a new stadium. I do think so. 3 thoughts. I think it's totally important what you were alluding to, Rick, that it's not just about the stadium, it's about the surrounding area around it. So it's good to be very thoughtful about that, because you don't want to do something that doesn't involve the community. The community always, needs to come first, even though the owners, and I'm not talking about just Jacksonville, but the owners obviously should be thinking about that, but sometimes they don't give it proper weight, right? So you need to think about the community. Number 2 is, what are the potential effects for other areas of Jacksonville? So here's where I can kind of bring in a little bit nerdy academic literature. There are a bunch of economists that study like sports stadiums, and I'm fascinated by it, because oftentimes, I know it's not the case here, but eminent domain is used to take property for sports stadiums. So this happened in Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn for the Nets' new arena. So there's an eminent domain story, but there's also economists who look at, well, what are the effects of building these stadiums? Does it have these kind of pro-growth, pro-community effects? And the evidence is kind of mixed, because one of the things that happens is, even if the area right around the stadium experiences growth and positive development, there's a question of whether that's creating new growth and development, or is it taking residents and retails from other parts of the city, and those are then declining to some extent. So to the extent that there are synergies that Jacksonville can leverage to create new growth, whether that's out of town money, people coming for concerts or other games, et cetera, maybe there's a positive side of the story. But to the extent that it's just taking existing businesses and relocating them, then it's not really a win-win. But the third and final point is, obviously the elephant in the room is, who should pay for it? Is it public tax dollars, or is it on the private side or the owner side? And my sense from doing a bit of reading is the proposal, or what the Jaguars have proposed, is kind of a 50-50 split. And so initially I saw that 1.2 billion price tag, and now they're talking 2 because of the development around it. But obviously $1 billion of public funding is not a drop in the bucket, right? And that's sort of, I would think some voters would hesitate or disapprove of it, and that's kind of where public policy, the rubber hits the road, right? If they allow people to vote on something like that, would people support it? You all would know that better than I would, but that's where having an informed citizenry who's up to speed on public policy issues can actually help, right, in making those decisions.
Thank you, Dan. So we're turned to questions. Mr. Walsh, Lou.
Thank you very much. Yes, I did guess 16 correctly. United Kingdom variable rate loan problems, and go through a whole list of them, but just thought I'd start with 2.
Ooh, tough. So, yeah, I think, and I'm not a macroeconomist, right? So even on the interest rate issue, that's kind of out of my area of expertise. I do think, we're kind of complaining about the high interest rate environment right now, but I do think for a long time interest rates were too artificially low, right? Like sort of the whole easy money, and even leading to the financial crisis, but then sort of this idea that we're going to have interest rates that low, historically way lower, I do think created some problems. But you're exactly right. There are housing issues. It's not like it's just a U.S. specific issue. China is in dire straits because of that. Like you said, the UK, basically anywhere. And I haven't traveled to China, but other places I go, either in the U.S. or globally, everybody's talking about this housing issue, right? And as one person said, you didn't used to necessarily hear about it as a national issue. I know LBJ and the Great Society, housing was part of that. But sort of now, like in national debates in the U.S., it's like an issue that politicians talking about how we're going to deal with housing. And then the fact that it's not specific to the U.S. means, okay, we need to look at solutions, and sometimes it's regulatory, illegal. in terms of sort of opening up. China, there's a whole host of real estate issues in China, and sometimes they're a little bit off of our radar screen. So not only in housing, but China, and I think this was in the Wall Street Journal recently too, just like office space, they've built way too much office, right? Sort of their expansion plans, and there, it's kind of the opposite side of Florida, right? Florida's getting all these people. China, because of the one child policy for so many decades, their population is going to be, so they're going to be in big trouble in terms of the real estate market and prices. But again, real estate is so, if you don't take you don't remember anything else they say, and the real estate people in the room will know this, it's so geographically specific, right? Because we take a number of our students to Thailand, and they're thinking the US mindset of like office, office is not a good asset class to be in. And then in Thailand, they see this office and hospitality, and it's exploding, right? So it very much differs on city, state, country, where you are. Could be totally different conditions. Office in a different country could be hot, and in the US, people are like, office, why would I invest in that?
Thank you. Next question. I saw a hand go up. John, did you have a question?
I'll let the gentleman here ask first. And
Thank you. So,
Michael.
bringing you back a little bit to what you said earlier about causes of the housing crisis.
Yeah.
What I didn't hear you mention, which affected my neighborhood in particular, well, two things. One is the rental corporation influx of buying properties. And then what I would call the Zillow effect and the controversy around what Zillow did. Do you see those as major issues that could have also contributed to our housing crisis?
Yeah, and just to clarify, do you mean like the housing crisis leading into 07, 08, or you also mean right now?
Yeah, right now.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because there's big disputes even on that in terms of, yes. So I think, Zillow, their venture in housing and residential was a complete flop. I do think one of the big issues on the table right now is some of the private equity folks who are, because there's obviously different models of housing, right? There's ownership, there's rental, there's single family versus multifamily, right? There's build to rent now is this, big new trend. Some of the kind of larger corporate players, the Blackstones and the like, have started to kind of move into the market because they see opportunities. I have not studied it closely. I kind of have a somewhat of a bit of a skepticism about whether that's good for neighborhoods and housing to have kind of the private equity folks are smart, right? And sometimes they add a lot of value. I do think on issues like housing, there's a lot of locally dispersed knowledge in terms of communities and housing markets. And just my view, I could be wrong, but if we wound up in a world in which, you had lots of ownership in the hands of private equity firms in terms of housing, single family homes that are being rented, I think that there may be some negative spillover effects from that we're not anticipating right now. But I'm glad you brought it up because it's very much a live issue and contested right now.
One final question, your final question.
Good afternoon. So my question is, how do you feel like the housing market is affected by, I guess, the migration? You speak about the migration. So like in Jacksonville, we see a lot of apartment buildings going up, a lot of new buildings, a lot of new accommodations for the influx of migration. But what about those old dilapidated buildings, let's say, on different parts of town? How is that affecting the market? And also, are there any subsidies or any incentives for people to actually get those old dilapidated buildings, or for the government to refurbish them for use?
Great question, and a great question to end up with. So a couple of thoughts. So I think the public policy with regard to housing, I think you're right. So two thoughts that are related. So one is, on the public policy, I'm kind of an all of the above approach on the housing issue. So for example, some type of housing that I think actually is useful for affordability is market rate housing. Some type is capital A affordable housing in which there may be necessary to have a government subsidy, right? Or homelessness prevention programs to prevent people from slipping into homelessness. So for example, in terms of the all-above approach, we actually have some researchers at Notre Dame who are looking at kind of a potentially counterintuitive idea of what happens in a community when you introduce more market rate housing in terms of affordability. And it's potentially counterintuitive because people normally think, well, more market rate housing, that's not necessarily helping the folks who are kind of looking for affordable housing. But it turns out, at least according to his preliminary research, is as you increase the housing supply, and this is very intuitive, just by having more units, well, what happens is then people move into those units, and then the ones where they vacated, somebody else moves into that unit. And so there's a natural migration and filtering. And by having more housing, period, right, even if it's kind of the fancier market rate housing, that actually helps affordability at several levels, right? Which is kind of a little bit counterintuitive, at least when you talk to folks in the affordable housing community, right? And there are concerns about market segmentation, like are these the same markets? But he kind of looks at those counter arguments and says, no, he still sees, and he looks at various cities to do this. So, but yes, I think in sometimes there'll have to be public-private partnerships. I think some of the government programs on housing, whether it's LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit, I think they should be looked at, right? And whether, I mean, there's people on different sides of the debate. Maybe the program is too small and it becomes very political, how to get the tax credits, so maybe it should be expanded. Or maybe there's some other alternative. The final thing I'll say, and this goes to your repurposing comment, at Notre Dame, we're very aware of this, in part because in addition to doing a housing initiative, we also have a new initiative in the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate called our Church Property Initiative. And what we're looking at here is churches, faith-based organizations. If you look at most cities, and even just driving around today, in Jacksonville, there are a lot of faith-based institutions, right? And sometimes it's a church, but oftentimes, at least in the Catholic church, there might be vacant land. There might be parking lots that are no longer used. There might be a convent that back in the day had a lot of sisters, or a rectory that had a lot of priests, but now is being used. We're looking at possibilities of how could you potentially either repurpose some of that, so some of that might fit into housing if it's currently, I mean, you might need to, remodel the bathrooms and things. There are a lot of properties like that. And sometimes, and we actually have a great case study in Austin, Texas on this, there's land that can be monetized that can both help the church with their cash flow, but also help the community or build something that real estate developers are interested in doing, whether that's in Jacksonville or in Austin, et cetera. So your repurposing question and point, I think, is right on. Because you do have these old, not just in faith-based ones, right? But there are older buildings, and the question is, how do we repurpose that to address the housing crisis?
Yeah, thank you very much. Would you like to make a brief comment? I know because it's so important, you're the director of it, on the Fitzgerald Institute and what you're trying to accomplish there to close out our discussion for this evening.
Yeah, I won't take too much time. You all have been very patient in listening to the conversation, but we think, as the world's largest asset class, real estate is going to be fundamentally important on several dimensions, including housing. And so what we're trying to do at Notre Dame, it's only 5 years old, this new Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate, but we're looking at these important public policy issues on housing, on repurposing properties that faith-based communities may own, and are looking to Notre Dame and others for what do we do? How do we get sophisticated in thinking about these assets? But one thing we know for certain is that in the years to come and in the decades to come, real estate is going to play. We want to get our students thinking, hey, this isn't just HGTV. I mean, my wife and I love the HGTV show, but sometimes they come in as freshmen and sophomores thinking that's what real estate is, and we're trying to open their eyes that you need to think about the policies, the legal issues, the investment opportunities for real estate. And so our hope is that as time goes by, we can help inform the policymakers, the next generation of real estate professionals, to think about real estate as a force for good.
And thank you very, very much. On behalf of Jacksonville University, the Public Policy Institute, and Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville, we have a little gift for you. And I want to thank you so much for coming down to this afternoon. Thank you all very much and have a great evening.